What makes the achievement of emotional sobriety so difficult is the habits we have, the patterns we have in our behavior, the habitual ways that we've come to think about things. We have to really become aware of those things in order to challenge them, because the consciousness that has created a lot of the problems in our life cannot solve it, cannot change things. So what happens is the first step is waking up. Well, tonight we are continuing our discussion of step 5. Last week, Herb kicked us off, and this week, Roger's going to take the lead. Next week, Thom Rutledge will take the lead in discussing step 5. And then the following week, maybe a couple weeks after that, I'll be taking the lead. But just let me say this. It's best to understand what's happening here in terms of the steps and emotional sobriety, and specifically how the steps help foster the cultivate a consciousness that leads to an authentic self-esteem that's based on humility. That's the theme of the workshop in the last several months now, as we've looked at how the 12 steps are related to self-esteem and emotional sobriety. But I just want to put it in context this before I hand this over to Roger. I talk often about the energy, right? The charge that develops. I thought of it the other day as almost a propellant, right? Is what moves us from one step to the other. And the first step is really about pain, right? A pain that creates an existential crisis. I cannot continue living my life the way I've been living my life. I need to change. Something needs to change drastically, dramatically, for me to turn things around. That charge is a powerful charge, as we know, and it's something that all of us, we run away from pain, but yet the value of experiencing that pain is what creates the possibility of an unbelievable magic that occurs as we start to work these steps. And that propels us, that crisis, that existential crisis, sets us up, because we're feeling quite hopeless at that point. We've admitted we're powerless. We see that our lives have become unmanageable, which means that we're in big trouble and we don't know what to do. And that's an important experience to have, to embrace, not to run away from, but to allow yourself to be steeped in that hopelessness. Bill even said it, that recovery is based upon a pedestal of hopelessness. So now that sets us up. The propellant is something has to resolve. We're in this crisis. And step 2 comes along and gives us hope, right? Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. We've talked about sanity as soundness of thinking. Our thinking is anything but sound when we start this journey. I'm not saying that that's an absolute across the board, because a lot of people would say it when people would come into recovery that your best thinking got you here. Well, that can be understood both ways, in terms of that, look, I've created a lot of trouble in my life in terms of with the way I look at things, but it also means that there's a part of me that wants to get well. Step 2 is based on hope. It's the installation of hope that there is a solution. So my crisis is resolved. It says there is another possibility. There's another way of life that's available, but I'm going to need to do something to discover it. So that's the propellant that moves us from step 2 into step 3, which is now we make a commitment. We make a decision to move away from the nonsense and to move towards the light, or as Herb likes to say, move away from the darkness towards the light. So we've made this commitment, right, that we're going to really pursue this. Now, a commitment, is followed by action. And step 4 is the first tangible evidence of our commitment. How do we approach step 4 and take a fearless and thorough moral inventory of ourselves? But there's something that happens is as we inventory, as we take a look at who we are, there's another force that moves us. And I want to mention that that force is the force, it's a growth force. It moves us towards being what we can be. It's a force that some psychologists have called self-actualization. It's a force that moves us towards wholeness. And if we think of wholeness as integrity, it's a force that's moving us in the direction of integrity. I don't mean that moralistically. I mean that more psychologically and spiritually. Holiness, right? Being whole, being complete, being what we can be. So that's the step that we are in step 4. And to be what we can be, we cannot just sit with these reflections ourselves. There's a strong desire for us to be in relationship too. And that's what is honored in step 5, is now we admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. So I just wanted to put that in context. I will now hand this over to Roger. Roger, good evening. And thanks so much for, being a part of this and adding all of the wisdom and that you do.
Wow, thank you. I appreciate that, Al. That was a really concise, nice summary, I think, Alan, of the connection, the interconnections between the 12 steps, emotional sobriety, and self-esteem, and a great summary of the first 4 steps and their connection to emotional sobriety and self-esteem. Good evening, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to kick things off tonight. So I have a question that I want to begin with. How can step 5 possibly increase anyone's self-esteem? That's the question. How can admitting my wrongs, talking about what's wrong with me, talking about the ways I've harmed others and myself, all the ways I've screwed up, all of my failings, how is this supposed to raise how I feel about myself, right? After all, when we learn about depression, isn't negative self-talk and thinking negatively about ourselves the centerpiece of depression? Isn't learning to think well of ourselves central to both our personal happiness and our positive self-esteem? So what are we talking about here? Shouldn't focusing on all that's wrong with me and acknowledging that and giving voice to that have a harmful effect on my self-esteem? That's my question. Well, let's turn to the man whose work we're using to guide our thinking about self-esteem, Nathaniel Branden. The book that we're referring to most often is his book called The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem. He wrote several others, and I'll start with a quote from one of his books called How to Raise Your Self-Esteem. Living consciously, which is one of his 6 pillars of self-esteem, the first one, living consciously implies respect for the facts of reality, the facts of our inner world, as well as the facts of our outer world. I want to emphasize that. The truth or facts of our inner world, the facts of our inner experience, as well as the facts of the outer world. Living consciously is living responsibly toward reality, not just toward me, not just toward my desire to have good beliefs and good feelings about myself. Living consciously is living responsibly toward reality. In other words, the more willing I am to see and admit and acknowledge truth, what's true as I can best understand it, especially when those truths make me uncomfortable. Alan was just talking about pain and its relationship to step 1. Well, it turns out that growth in our self-esteem has a lot to do with our relationship with pain as well, and especially to do with our willingness to look at and allow ourselves to explore aspects of reality that are painful to us, that we would rather not see. Every time I orient myself toward truth, especially truths that are painful for me to look at, my self-esteem increases. I'm going to say that again, because it has a lot to do with how step 5 can increase one's self-esteem, right? Every time I bring myself to look at truths that cause me discomfort, that cause me pain to look at, embarrassment, shame, humiliation, whatever, right? Anxiety, my self-esteem increases. In talking about living consciously in this book, he mentioned a number of characteristics that are growing and getting stronger within us as we grow in our ability to live more consciously. And again, all of these 6 pillars are practices, right? They are on a spectrum, a continuum. So we can have a little bit of self-esteem one day, substantially better self-esteem another day, better self-esteem in some areas of our life than others. But it is meaningful, I think, to talk about a generalized sense of self-esteem that we have and how that can grow over time, because it can. But 2 of those attributes that typify a growth in living more consciously is increased honesty with oneself. Again, think about step 5, right? Rather than dishonesty. Another one is increased willingness to confront ourselves rather than avoid ourselves. And I'm not talking about a spirit of hostile confrontation. In that sense, confrontation might not be the best word. I'm talking about a willingness to investigate, a willingness to look at ourselves with eyes that are clear as we can, a willingness to seek to understand ourselves. That's what I mean by self-confrontation rather than self-avoidance. In his book, The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, he goes on to say, if we do not bring an appropriate level of consciousness to our activities, if we do not live mindfully, the inevitable penalty is a diminished sense of self-efficacy and self-respect. So what is he saying here? A couple of points that are really important to understand. He's talking about bringing an appropriate level of consciousness to the activity that we are currently engaged in. If I'm, laying in a hammock on a Sunday afternoon, I'm probably going to be, and hopefully going to be, in a very different state of consciousness than if I'm giving this presentation right now, or if I'm having a talk about something important to me with somebody that I love. So the issue is not that we are constantly zeroed in and hyper-focused every moment of our lives. That's not what an appropriate state of consciousness means. It means it's appropriate to what we're engaged in at the moment. He says the inevitable penalty, if we're not living mindfully, is a diminished sense of self-efficacy and self-respect. Well, self-efficacy means self-confidence, a sense of competence or capability, a sense of our ability to deal with the basic challenges of life. That's one of his key pieces of self-esteem, is self-efficacy. And the other is self-respect, part of which means, how worthy do I feel of happiness? How worthy do I feel of love? How worthy do I feel of being here, of being alive? We cannot feel competent and worthwhile conducting our lives in a mental fog. Our mind is our basic tool of survival. Betray it and our self-esteem suffers. The simplest form of this betrayal is the evasion of discomforting facts. Now, those may be facts about us, about me. It may be facts about other people. It may be facts about situations and contexts that I find myself in. But the simplest form of betrayal of our mind, he writes, is when we feel uncomfortable and we run, right? We get away from that situation as fast as we can. One way to measure the growth of self-esteem is a gradual growth in our ability to hold ourselves still when we want to bolt, right? To hold ourselves to a situation where The reality is something I'm really uncomfortable with. So how is it that step 5 can build our self-esteem? Well, there's nothing like step 5 to bring us up against discomforting aspects of our very personal reality, right? And if it's true that it's holding ourselves to the goal of aligning ourselves with reality as much as we can, that's a big part of the way that step 5 has a positive impact on our self-esteem. My primary allegiance is to reality, not to making myself look good, even in my own eyes. That's not the only thing about step 5 that I think can enhance self-esteem. Another big part is that I reveal my secrets. I let go of my secrets. I bring what's been hidden in the shadows, along with all the feelings of shame and embarrassment and humiliation and guilt, remorse, regret, on, right? I start to bring all of that up out of the shadows, and Bill talks about that and the power of that in the 12 and 12 when he's writing about step 5. So that's another big factor, I believe, in why step 5 can be very enhancing of our self-esteem. A simpler way to say it is confession is good for the soul, right? Confession is good for the soul. And Bill acknowledges that in his writings about step 5 and how that's been true through the ages for us as people, not just in recent times. So I want to say more about the 6 pillars and their connection to step 5. As we've talked about the 6 pillars, we've really come, from my point of view, to talk about 9 pillars, 7 of which Nathaniel Branden talks about in his books, living more consciously. And again, these are all on a continuum, from more to less, from less to more. Learning to live more consciously, learning to live gradually and with practice, because these are all practices. If they're going to change, if we're going to progress, they're all practices. The second is living with greater self-acceptance. The third is living with increased ability to take responsibility for my happiness, for my life, for my decisions. The fourth is an ability to become more assertive, more able to express my wants, my likes, my dislikes, more able to be curious about the likes and dislikes and wants of others, more willing to inquire of them about what they want in their life and from our interaction with each other. The last 2 that he talks about are living with greater personal integrity or wholeness, as Alan just said, where I'm not in as many pieces all the time. And the last is living with a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning. And that doesn't just mean a grand overall purpose, an answer to why am I here, but it means each day having a sense of purpose or focus. He talks about how his wife helped him become purposeful about a quality that didn't come that naturally to Nathaniel, which was kindness. He was very serious about thinking and working and creating and integrity and self-esteem. And very often treating people with as much kindness as he would have liked to wasn't on his radar. And his wife brought that to his attention. When he became more purposeful, more conscious about the issue of kindness, and developed more intentionality each day around the issue of just being a kinder human being, he became a kinder person. So the idea of being more purposeful has a lot of different levels of application to us for each day. But in addition to those 6 pillars, thank you, Herb Kagan. Herb pointed out that at the end of the book, The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, Nathaniel talks about willingness. Willingness primarily to put into practice these 6 pillars that he's identified. But we're also treating willingness as a 7th pillar. And then we've added a couple more, one of which Alan already referenced, the importance of humility to an authentic sense of self-esteem. And lastly, For me, the ninth pillar, if you want to look at it that way, is a much greater emphasis on relatedness, on relationship and connection than Nathaniel Branden tends to talk about. He doesn't not talk about it. He addresses it to some degree. But for me, how I treat other people, how I encourage or allow or discourage them to treat me, how open I am to connecting, or how willing I am to write other people off, how willing I am to be vulnerable or open or honest or dishonest in my communication with others. All of those things are immensely relevant from my point of view to my sense of self-worth. So it's very important to me to have an emphasis on relationship, on connection as an element to our self-esteem as well. To connect it more to step 5, I want to actually start with two of the pillars that we've added, which is relatedness and a sense of humility. In writing about the benefits of doing step 5, he talks, Bill W. in the 12 and 12, talks specifically about relatedness in this way. What are we likely to receive from step 5? For one thing, we shall get rid of that terrible sense of isolation we've always had. Almost without exception, alcoholics are tortured by loneliness. Even before our drinking got bad and people began to cut us off, nearly all of us suffered the feeling that we didn't quite belong. And then he goes on to talk about how for many people, beginning to connect to AA, or NA or other 12-step programs, begin to create a sense of belonging. But that sense of belonging and connection really gets brought home in step 5 from Bill's point of view, as the person sits there and shares their guts and the things they feel guiltiest about or worst about with God, with themselves, and with another person. So right away, that's one way in which step 5 enhances and helps create enhanced self-esteem. He goes on to say, a second dividend or a second benefit we may expect from confiding our defects in another human being is humility, a word often misunderstood. One moment. To those who have made progress in AA, it amounts to a clear recognition of what and who we really are. Now think about that, about the emphasis that Branden placed on getting in touch with reality, on getting in touch with truth and giving voice to what's true. Thom Rutledge with us has a wonderful way of defining humility. He talks about it as reality, as coming into reality. And I'll have more to say about that in a moment. It amounts to a clear recognition of what and who we really are, followed by a sincere attempt to become what we could be. Therefore, our first practical move toward humility must consist of recognizing our deficiencies. No defect can be corrected unless we clearly see what it is. Wow. So that's him talking about humility, but what else is he talking about? Branden uses very similar language in talking about self-acceptance. We can't change that we're unaware of. We can't change that we're not willing to look at. We can't change that we're not willing to accept the reality of, right? So already, with those two major benefits from Bill's point of view of doing step 5, we're already deeply intertwined with the 9 pillars from my perspective of self-esteem. With regard to humility, there's a couple other things I wanted to mention. Remember the American psychological definition of humility: the quality of being humble, characterized by low focus on self and accurate, neither over or under estimation of our accomplishments and worth, and acknowledgement of one's limitations, imperfections, mistakes, gaps in knowledge, and so on. So that really drives home the connection between step 5 in terms of acknowledgement of imperfections, acknowledgement of mistakes, and self-esteem and humility. Just briefly, because I see the time, it's easy to connect all of the other steps from my point of view, to step 5. And I'll just briefly highlight them for just 2 minutes. Willingness. Well, it takes a lot of willingness to be willing to sit and honestly convey to somebody the worst things that I see about myself, the worst things that I've done, right? Wrongs I have committed. Willingness takes a lot of that. What about the others? Well, self-acceptance I already referenced. If I'm not willing to accept in the sense of facing, doesn't mean I like them, doesn't mean I don't want to change them as I move forward in my life. I do. But if we want to change it, we need to accept the reality of it. That's the sense in which I'm using acceptance here. So step 5 takes a tremendous amount of self-acceptance. Everything I give voice to requires a level of acceptance and willingness to face it. Self-responsibility. What better example could I give of beginning to take increased responsibility for my past actions in my life than step 5? Self-assertiveness. I'm engaged in the very act of self-assertiveness, right? I'm here giving voice to these difficult to talk about truths about myself. The same with integrity. I am in the process in step 5 of what? Of making myself more whole, of making my words line up more with my values. And as Bill put it, owning who I have been and who I am in order to help myself become who I want to be. And that connects to the final pillar, which is purposefulness. I have a purpose in doing this step and acknowledging these character flaws, these imperfections in me. And that purpose is to help myself move forward in my life toward whom I deeply want to become. So that's just a sketch of all the ways that I think and we're having 9 of them here, right? Every pillar that we talk about of self-esteem connects up to step 5. And of course, the other steps as well. I went over, guys. I apologize for that. So now I defer to my colleagues here. Thank you.
There's no need for an apology, Roger. None at all. It was outstanding. And I'm just letting, Brian, can you help me let Thom and Herb in the spotlight?
Yeah, I got you.
Come on, Brian.
Roger.
So slow.
There's Herb, and here comes Thom.
But you can count on Thom.
Thom.
Thom will hassle you about it, Brian. You can count on that.
Well, you know, I need a little bit of that every once in a while.
Oh, I just send text to him all day long to hassle him just for the hell of it.
There you go.
Keep him on his toes. It's
Why don't you kick us off, Thom? Why don't you go ahead?
all right. I'm sitting there trying to be respectful and kind and have good manners with Herb, and I'm sitting there, but I'm just kind of chomping at the bit. There's purpose is practice. I love that. That's a nutshell right there, Roger. When you talk about the idea that you know, not general purpose, but purpose of the day, purpose of the moment, the purpose of us sitting here right now as part of that daily practice is so that's just such it just rings true. It's the one first thing I wrote down about in your question. I'd love to begin your beginning question with how could step 5, you know, I had 2 responses. How could step 5 possibly help us with our self-esteem? I started to just cut in and just say, you know, kind of like the mob voice, like, he's right, let's get out of here. You know, we'd all go out to the movies or something. But here's what I wrote about in response to that. It takes guts to let ourselves be seen. It takes guts to let ourselves be known. And that's what step 5 is. It is, you know, it is. And one of the things that's a pet peeve of mine, it's about it. Step 5 is really, it's not the only way that we do it. And it's not the only way we should do it, but it is a challenge for those of us who have a strong tendency, and a lot of us do in a defensive way, to compartmentalizing ourselves, to letting some people know some things about us and other people know other things about us, but no one knows everything about us. And ultimately, I will do the disclaimer. Nobody know, no, we don't even know everything about us. But it's like I have a friend who passed away recently, and this is one of my main things that I used to always often talk with her about, and that she was so afraid of being known that she never, there was hardly anybody who knew all of her, and it's a form of dishonesty with other people. It's a dishonesty with ourselves. And so I think one of the things we're talking about that connects to self-esteem for step 5 is it is basically saying, okay, if the goal here is not to just be happy, but to actually feel good about ourselves and to have, and I'm a big believer that self-respect, I'm a big fan of having a good time. I'm a big fan of happy, but self-respect is so much more important, so much more a part of the point of all of this stuff. It's our integrity. It's like saying what I mean and doing what is congruent with that is about personal integrity and self-respect. And I feel like this step 5 is the challenge. And I'll read what Bill, at the very first sentence in 12 and 12 of step 5. It's perfect to what you're talking about. All of AA's 12 steps ask us to go contrary to our natural desires. They all deflate our egos. When it comes to ego deflation, few steps are harder to take than 5. I would go so far as to add to him a little bit and say, no step is harder to take than 5 when it comes to ego deflation. So that's really the main point I want to point out there is it takes guts. This is a step where we really can not only step up, but we can actually feel good about ourselves. And that's not arrogance. That doesn't mean, because we don't want that false humility. We want the real thing. And the real thing is, as you said, Roger, is reality. And the reality of that is, it's I need to own my shortcomings, but it's also credit where credit is due. And if I'm being brave enough to step into that step 5 and sit there with another human being and share this stuff, as most of us would say, without in terms of the multiple nature of our consciousness, without a unanimous vote on the inside, because I've never shared the deepest stuff that I've shared with people. I've never done that without somebody inside there objecting, screaming at me as I was doing it, but it's like, I know that I'm doing the right thing when I do that. And I know that I am living my life congruently with my value system that is chosen. And I'm adding to that. I know that I'm practicing my purpose in that moment.
Cool. All right. Herb.
Amen. Praise Herb.
Hi, my name is Herb, and I'm an alcoholic. Thank you, Roger, very much. And so much. There's just so much in that. My experience with the 5th step, both doing it and hearing it, is, and I could make a lot of comments about, but this one is the most important from my standpoint, is for the very first time reading it out loud. When I had written it discreetly over weeks or months, reading it out loud consecutively for the very first time, I had an experience connecting me and all the parts and all my history for the very first time, seeing that connection and having an experience of the impact of me on me and the impact of me on others for the very first time. And the truth will set you free, but first it will embarrass you. And yeah. And that was my 100% experience. But and you mentioned it about consciousness and the truth. That was a very soul surgery healing process. Yeah.
I love that, Herb. The
That's
truth
good.
will set you free, but first it'll embarrass the shit out of you. My addition. And
Yep.
well said, man.
Yep.
Well said. you know.
Well, first of all, Roger, I just want to, acknowledge how well you talk about self-esteem and tying this stuff together. I'm sitting here and I learn something each time that you're sharing. So it's very stimulating for me to do this with all of you guys. I just love how just out of this discussion, so many, thoughts and insights start to emerge. And I'll just try to keep this short, which is difficult for me to do at times, but there's a few things and I wasn't even in the monastery and quiet for 7 years. I've been talking all my life and I still can't shut up. Herb at least has got an excuse for his behavior. I don't have any.
Oh, it's been long enough. He doesn't have an excuse anymore.
After 60 years, there's no excuse.
That's right. Yeah, but he likes to say that just so that we give him a lot of room so that he can go on and on and on. I know that. So look, the first thing is that I really, it's so clear on what's happening for us as we're doing this. You see, Bill talked about it, is that we're going against our nature, but the truth of it is we're going against our false self,
Right.
which we've identified with, right? We identified that I have to be this idealized self, this concept of who I should be for me to be okay. And every step, Bill calls it a deflation of the ego. We can also say it an unraveling, right, of this false self, this engineered self that we've developed. And there's nothing that unravels it more than going contrary to the set of values that the false self has. So you just think about the shift that's taking place in our consciousness from before. I think you said it, Thom, about it's all about looking good, right? It's all about image, right? I love Canon put that whole thing out. Image is everything. Well, it wasn't just selling cameras. That's what has been sold in our society, this culture that promotes narcissism. Image is everything. We've all bought that at various levels of in our consciousness and in our souls. And so our life was directed in that way. And then what does Bill say? Realizing how wrong we are and having a hard time getting off the merry-go-round. Well, of course it's hard to get off, because when you've constructed a whole life based on this image and of looking a certain way to be okay, and now we're asking you to do the opposite. I love what you said. Yes, the truth will set you free, but it's going to embarrass you, humiliate you. It's going to cause a real and an appropriate amount of tension between who you were and who you're trying to become. So I want to say this again. That tension, Tom Rutledge and I talk about the intrapsychic forces at our work. That's a good tension. That's a good battle to join. Who you were and who you're becoming. There's a very different voice for both of those inside of your consciousness. One final thing I wanted to say, what connected me tonight is humility is about embracing our humanity.
Yeah.
It really is. If we want to boil it down to one
100%.
thing,
Yeah, 100%.
it is like, my God, I thought I'll say it even stronger. I was ashamed of my humanity. My humanity made me feel less than by the way I was looking at it. And here, talk about the shift in consciousness. Humanity begins to set me free, where before it seemed to be shackles that I didn't want to own, that I wanted to deny, that I wanted to run away from, as like it was, a burning building, and I had to get out of there as fast as I can. Now, as our consciousness starts to move towards a consciousness of freedom, of emotional sobriety, that consciousness of freedom has a lot to do with embracing my humanity. And one of the ways of looking at what's happening in each of these steps is that we're moving towards becoming what we really are. He calls it what we could be. We can be more human. That's one thing we can be. We'll never be perfect. We'll never be all the things maybe we should be and all that other nonsense that we put in our heads.
But we can be more fully human. That's beautiful.
Yes, that's right. We can be more. And Carl Rogers said that. It's
Mhm.
that the purpose in life is becoming more fully human.
Mhm.
So thanks for such
Right.
a stimulating
Right.
discussion, Roger. Very
Yes,
much so.
absolutely.
Thank you.
And by the way, preview, if I'm leading next time, preview for this, there
You
will
are.
be, by next week, there will be 16 pillars.
And when I get to it, there'll be 32. And by the time we're done with this thing,
I know this.
there'll be
Hey,
no
listen,
pillars.
I recognize the competition here. I get it.
I hear a lot of people criticize the 12 steps that they're old-fashioned. I can understand that criticism. They were written back in 1935. Some people that are agnostic have difficulty with the word God used in the steps. For me, I look at the process that's involved, the forces that the 12 steps generate are so powerful that I think they're ageless. There's this interesting phenomena that happens when you work the steps. They create a charge and then a discharge. You know, the first step, we're powerless. Our life has become unmanageable. It creates this charge. You know, we're in big trouble and we don't know what to do. And then step 2 comes along and it says we have hope. That charge, that existential crisis that we have is resolved. What's happening here is parallel to life. We charge ourselves when we breathe in. When we exhale, we discharge. That's the rhythm of life. And the way I love to think about the 12 steps, it's helping us get connected to the rhythm of life so we can learn how to show up in a good way.